In the second part of our lecture on autonomic nervous system, we're going to focus on the parasympathetic nervous system and then some pathologies that can take place within the ANS. The parasympathetic nervous system, you may recall, is involved with homeostasis and energy conservation. It is our rest and digest, our feed and breed system. Do you recall where the somas are for the preganglionic neurons and for the postganglionic neurons? Also, do you remember how the neurons reach their target organs? After a bit of review, hopefully you'll remember that the preganglionic neurons are located in the brainstem, and specifically they're going to be located in parasympathetic nuclei for cranial nerves 3, 7, 9, and 10. They're also located in the area that would be a lateral horn of sacral 2, 3, and 4 spinal cord levels. Keep in mind that at this part of the spinal cord, there isn't a true lateral horn that sticks out, but it's the same location. So I'm fine if you say lateral horn. Our postganglionic cell bodies are located in terminal ganglia at or near the target organ. So how do the neurons reach their target organ? Well, if they are coming from a parasympathetic nucleus up in the brainstem, their axons are going to travel in those cranial nerves. So cranial nerves 3, 7, 9, and 10. If they're coming from the spinal cord, those axons are going to travel in the pelvic splanchnic nerve. The parasympathetic nervous system is much more simple than the sympathetic nervous system in all regards, and that includes the receptors and the neurotransmitter. The parasympathetic nervous system uses only one neurotransmitter, and that is acetylcholine. All receptors are cholinergic. All of the receptors on the postsynaptic neuron, on its cell body membrane and its dendrites, are nicotinic. And there will always be an excitatory response, so they'll always generate EPSPs. All of the receptors at the target organ are muscarinic. These can either be excitatory or inhibitory, so they may result in EPSPs or may result in IPSPs, depending upon the receptor and the target organ. So here we see our preganglionic neuron, which would be located in the parasympathetic nucleus for cranial nerve 3, 7, 9, or 10, or located in the region of the lateral horn in S2, 3, or 4 of the spinal cord. Long preganglionic, short postganglionic, because that postganglionic cell body is in the terminal ganglion at or near the target organ. Both neurons release acetylcholine, so both are going to be using cholinergic receptors. The receptors on the postganglionic neuron are nicotinic receptors. They will always generate EPSPs so that the postganglionic neuron reaches threshold and fires. At the target organ, the receptors are muscarinic, which can, depending upon the ion channel that they are connected with, will either create EPSPs or IPSPs to either excite or inhibit the cells of the target organ. But it's always acetylcholine and always a type of cholinergic receptor. This means that if somebody is taking an anticholinergic medication, such as is often used for people who have trouble with bladder incontinence, that it's going to bind to these receptors to decrease the parasympathetic nervous system activity to that target organ. And this is a link that will take you to another image showing you the different receptors along with the acetylcholine used by the parasympathetic nervous system. So again, the parasympathetics travel in 4 cranial nerves. Cranial nerve 3, oculomotor nerve, where it goes to constrict your pupil, and to this muscle of the ciliary muscle of the eye that changes the shape of the lens of the eye for accommodation. Cranial nerve 7, facial nerve, where it goes to the lacrimal glands for the production of tears, as well as to the salivary glands, where it helps to thin the secretions and increase the saliva. Cranial nerve 9, glossopharyngeal nerve, also goes to salivary glands. And cranial nerve 10, vagus nerve, where it goes to smooth and cardiac muscle of the thorax and abdomen through the level of the transverse colon. You will not be responsible for knowing which salivary glands are innervated by facial nerve and which by glossopharyngeal nerve. Just know salivary glands is good enough. We also have our preganglionics in S2, 3, and 4 of the spinal cord. So in here we have a kind of a summary chart where we see the preganglionic cell bodies are located in the parasympathetic nuclei of cranial nerves 3, 7, 9, and 10, as well as S2, 3, 4 of the spinal cord. Postganglionic cell bodies are in the terminal ganglia in or near the target organ. The pathways they take are the cranial nerves 3, 7, 9, and 10, or the pelvic splanchnic nerves. The neurotransmitter used is acetylcholine from both neurons. The first synapse will involve nicotinic receptors. The second synapse will involve muscarinic receptors. And here we have a comparison slide with sympathetic and parasympathetic. Our preganglionic cell bodies for sympathetic are located completely within the spinal cord at T1 to L2 or possibly L3, whereas parasympathetics are split between the brainstem and the spinal cord at S2, 3, 4. Our postganglionic cell bodies are located in either the paravertebral ganglia of the sympathetic trunk or a preaortic ganglion on the anterior aspect of the aorta. There's also another part of the system that is considered to be part of the sympathetic nervous system, and that would be our adrenal gland on top of our kidney. It's not a ganglion because it's not neuron cell bodies situated there. It's a gland, but it is part of our sympathetic nervous system, and it is innervated by a preganglionic neuron. In the parasympathetic system, everything goes to a terminal ganglion. We have many pathways in the sympathetic system, many fewer in the parasympathetic. So in our sympathetic system, if we're going up to the head, we're looking at branches of the carotid arteries as our road. If we're going to the bronchi, we're looking at sympathetic thoracic visceral nerves. Going to the heart, sympathetic cardiac nerves. Going to the trunk or limbs, we're talking about the spinal nerves, our peripheral nerves. Going to the abdominal and pelvic viscera, or to the adrenal gland, we're talking about sympathetic splanchnic nerves. In the parasympathetic system, we're looking at cranial nerves 3, 7, 9, and 10, and the pelvic splanchnic nerve. In the sympathetic system and in the parasympathetic system, our preganglionic neurons put out acetylcholine, and they use nicotinic receptors at this pre to post ganglionic synapse. So our first synapse is always ACH, always using nicotinic receptors, always generating EPSPs. But our post ganglionic neuron can give off release either ACH, which it does in the parasympathetic system all the time, and in a minority of the time in the sympathetic system. But when it does, it uses muscarinic receptors. The primary neurotransmitter from the sympathetic system, however, from our postganglionic neurons, are adrenergic, norepinephrine or epinephrine from the adrenal gland. Our norepinephrine receptors, so our adrenergic receptors, are our alphas and our betas. Alpha 1 and alpha 2, which I've not asked you to distinguish from each other, as their outcome ends up being the same, even though it's a different mechanism. But our beta 1s, our beta 2s, and our beta 3s, of which I want you to know one or two primary roles. I want to talk about control of the autonomic nervous system by other centers. So remember, we have a lot of nuclei for vital functions in our brainstem. Our medulla and pons have nuclei that control vital functions, but these are modulated by higher structures yet, such as the hypothalamus, the thalamus, and our limbic system. We have descending tracts predominantly from the hypothalamus to different nuclei in the brainstem, and from those nuclei down into the spinal cord that help to carry input to our autonomic neurons. Our limbic system as well has connections with the autonomic nervous system, so that we have autonomic changes as a result of different emotions. So for instance, if you're embarrassed, you begin to blush, or you're nervous and your heart rate goes up, or you might start to cry when you're sad. A couple of pathologies I want to talk about. One or two of these I would like you to know. The others you will not need to know. So the two I want you to know are autonomic dysreflexia, which we talked about in the spinal cord with spinal cord injuries, and Horner syndrome. So again, if you go back to the when we talked about autonomic dysreflexia, you'll remember that the problem with a high injury of the spinal cord is that information from the brainstem cannot get down to the sympathetic nervous system neurons, preganglionic neurons, to shut them off, to inhibit them, so that they do not cause large vasoconstriction and an increase in blood pressure. So with autonomic dysreflexia, something is stimulating the sympathetic neurons from below the level of injury, and the normal inhibition that would occur from the brainstem, once it starts to sense the increased blood pressure, it says, whoa, that's getting too high, we need to shut that off. Well, we can't shut it off. Excuse me. Horner syndrome is a lesion of the sympathetic nervous system pathway to the head. If you have an injury anywhere in the pathway, you end up losing sympathetic innervation to one side of the face. It's also been found to occur bilaterally in some instances, depending on the injury. The prominent symptoms are ptosis, meiosis, anhidrosis, and flushing. So ptosis is a droopy eyelid. They can't open the eyelid all the way. Meiosis is pupillary constriction, so they have a very tiny, small pupil. Anhidrosis is drying of the skin because there's absence of sweating. And then we get flushing because there's vasodilation. We can't constrict the blood vessels in the skin. So those are kind of the classic symptoms that you would see. So just like our sensory pathways and our motor pathways that we talked about from the spinal cord, if we injured them in the peripheral nerve or in the spinal cord or in the brainstem or in the brain, we still ended up with a problem where the receptor was located, or we ended up with a problem where the neuromuscular junction was located. Same thing here. I've now got a pathway that's starting in my cerebrum, thalamus, or hypothalamus. Hypothalamus is a big one. Neurons are sent down through the brainstem to different brainstem nuclei. Neurons are then sent down into the spinal cord to the sympathetic nerves, the preganglionics and the upper thoracic levels of the spinal cord. Those preganglionic neurons, axons, enter the sympathetic trunk and ascend up to the very top, to the most superior cervical paravertebral ganglion. There we have our synapse with our postganglionic neuron, which then moves over by the carotid artery and follows the artery branches up to the face. So if I damage my brainstem in these descending sympathetic neurons, I'm going to not be able to activate my sympathetics, and I'm going to end up with Horner syndrome. If I have a spinal cord injury in the cervical or upper thoracic levels that damages those descending sympathetic neurons, or damages the sympathetic preganglionic neurons, I'm going to have Horner syndrome. If I damage the sympathetic trunk in the cervical region or upper thoracic levels, where those preganglionic neurons are entering. I'm going to have Horner syndrome. So it can be anywhere in that pathway that we could have an injury that can result in Horner syndrome. And it's not an unusual, it's fairly common syndrome to see with people who have had brainstem or upper cervical injuries. And then these couple I'm going to mention, but you do not need to know them. Excuse me. We have Raynaud's disease, which is a disorder of the sympathetic nervous system innervation of the peripheral vasculature. Person tends to get very excessive and prolonged vasoconstriction, particularly in response to things like cold. It can be so prolonged and so excessive that they end up with a dry gangrene and can end up losing their fingers, for instance. So if you have someone with Raynaud's disease or Raynaud's syndrome, they're slightly different, but you never want to use ice treatment or cold therapy with them because you could trigger their Raynaud's. Hirschsprung's disease is also known as megacolon, and this is where the person is lacking the parasympathetic nerve innervation, excuse me, in the bowel. So the bowel is otherwise normal, but the terminal ganglia are missing. We have no postganglionic neurons. This leads to a lot of dilation of the colon and chronic constipation, and is a major problem for these individuals. So that is the end of week 8 and our lectures on the ANS.